Yes, sir, they have the doors to open 10 at the bridge. Michael Brown
Good morning. My name is Philip. I'm the pastor of Grace Collective Church, and I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that I'm here. Honestly, I've been gone the last 2 out of the last 3 weeks, and many of you have been praying for me and my family and the family of my dear friend Robbie, who is with Jesus now, and thank you so much. If you're a brand new guest, I'll explain that in a little bit, but it's been crazy. It's been a crazy few weeks. As a matter of fact, last night we were laying down in bed, and I realized that last night was the first night that the six of us, I have 4 kids, that the 6 of us were all in the house and no one else was staying there. It's the first time since June. And it's been like over 3 weeks that all of us were at the house and that it was just us at the house. It was the first night in the month of July that it was our family in the house. And that just, I don't know, I just kind of laid there and thought about that and thought about how crazy our life has been over the last few weeks and how crazy this season is for a lot of folks with travel and vacations. And it is vacation season, and right now it's just melting season. I'm so over summer. And I know we still have August to go, but man, I'm done. Like I just would walk to the car and start sweating, and I don't know how people in the 1800s did it with all that stuff on. But it's vacation season, and I started thinking about all the things that we do and kind of the insanity that we go through and walk through in this season. I don't know, my family a few years ago, maybe you're one of these families that has a Carowinds pass. You go to Carowinds a lot, right? You do? Anybody do Carowinds? Yeah, okay, y'all are insane. You don't want to mention that you were insane, but you are. We are too. You stand in those lines, and it just, like, at some point, it just doesn't make any sense. If you were to sit down and write it on paper, there's no reason to do this. To stand in a line for 30, 45, maybe even longer minutes for a ride that lasts, what, 30 seconds, right? And that makes no sense. And even worse, if you have young children, you go to the Woodstock gliders. You know what I'm talking about, the Woodstock gliders? Which is possibly the best ride in Carowinds, honestly. But the line is just crazy long, and I think that when you walk through to get on there, the person who's running it just makes a judgment on whether you're a nice person or not, and they make it longer or shorter for you. And if that's just the way I see it, I don't know. Maybe there's a timer. But then you think about the people that go to Disney World, and we've been to Disney World with our kids a couple of times. Have you been to the Disney World or the Disneylands, right? Okay, a lot of people. This makes no sense. The first part is, if you go to Disney World, you have to go to the state of Florida, okay? My wife is from Florida. She married me to get her green card. That's just kind of how the joke goes in my family. But this makes no sense. You have to drive all the way to Orlando. You have to get in the lines for wherever you're staying or the line to park at the park, and you get in those lines, and you've got to go to all the different parks, and so you just plan days upon days of waiting in lines so that you can enjoy this experience. The longest line, the first time we took our kids to Disney World, we've been twice with them, with the longest line was to meet Mickey. It wasn't to ride Space Mountain, it wasn't to see a show, it was just to see the mouse, the person in a costume who had mechanically blinking eyes. That was the most, and we waited in that line for over an hour just to take a picture with Mickey Mouse. Mind you, there's a Mickey Mouse just roaming the park that you can just stop and talk to. But that one was like the real one. So it made no sense at all to me. And then we just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we went to the beach. Perhaps you've been to the beach this season. Our students just got back from a great trip. By the way, thank you to Ward and all of our GCS volunteers. You guys are amazing. Those of you who went, those of you who stayed back and prayed, those of you who stayed back and then went and then came home, y'all are awesome. Our students had an amazing time. But perhaps you've gone to the beach. I went to the beach, and we have young children, and then we went with friends who have an even younger baby. So the gear you have to tote out to the beach And some of you are like peers, like, no, just go out there with my towel. Well, you're not married, and you don't have children. You don't know what going to the beach is like. You don't know anything, honestly. I just say that because I'm bitter. But I was walking out to the beach just a couple of weeks ago. I had the tent on my shoulder because we go to the real beach, which is in Charleston, not Myrtle, which is just like, I don't know, an ashtray. Apologies if you love Myrtle Beach. You know, I'm saying the truth. Okay, so you can't use the tents. That's why I say that. So we're going out there. I have a tent on my shoulder. I'm pulling the cooler with this hand. My oldest daughter is pushing the cart that you see there in the picture, which is loaded down with a minimum of 4 to 5 to 6, maybe 18 chairs on it, and all the boogie boards and the sand gear and all that stuff, while my wife is then carrying a child and probably another bag full of stuff. And we're going out to the beach to spend time, to have fun as a family. Oh my word. And I think as I'm carrying all this stuff out, like, this is fine. But at some point, I'm going to have to carry it all back. That's the worst part, man. Like, I see people in my neighborhood. We have a little pool in front of our neighborhood, and they're walking down. They're being all good and health conscious and whatever, eat green. And they're walking to the pool instead of me, who's like cranking up the diesel engine to drive the 0.4 miles to the pool. It's not the walk down that's bad. It's like after you expend yourself at the pool, you got to walk back up that hill, man. And I'm just not willing to do that. But then you think about, like, with all this stuff, with the Carowinds, the Disney World, the beach, all the stuff, the gear, then you think about the money that it takes to do all of these activities, right? And the money that you're essentially simply throwing out the window. That's what you're doing. You're just throwing it out the window, right? But at some point in this, and you know, if you were to write it all down, the trip doesn't make sense. Waiting in line doesn't make sense. The money doesn't make sense. At some point, we made a decision that this temporary, this short-term difficulty was worth the long-term payoff, right? The short-term difficulty was worth the long-term payoff. Carrying the junk out to the beach is going to be worth it. Waiting in the lines with the kids, taking the pictures, doing all those things. The money spent, the short-term difficulty was worth the long-term payoff. And as we think through these vital signs in life, as we think about our walk with the Lord, we come to a very difficult passage. We come to a very difficult piece of one passage. And if you haven't been with us, we've been in Romans 12. I'd love for you to turn to Romans 12. We're going to be in one verse. We've been in this verse last week. We're in this verse this week. We're going to be in it next week. It's not that long a verse either. But today we're specifically going to be talking about the middle portion of that verse. And here's Romans 12:12. This is what Romans 12:12 says. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Last week Matthew shared about what it means to rejoice in hope. And today our time we're going to talk about what it means to be patient in tribulation, which is one of those things that you never ever ask the Lord to teach you. You don't pray for patience, people, because He will give it to you. He will teach you how to be patient. And as I think about our spiritual life, and I think about my personal walk with the Lord, and I think about how can I recognize in my own life whether or not I'm healthy, I'm spiritually healthy. Am I rejoicing in hope like Matthew shared last week? What does it mean to be patient in tribulation? What is Paul telling the Romans there? Well, the word patient that he uses, it's not just like a patient like you and I think, especially in our Southern American context. To be patient is to sit and wait on the girl to finish getting ready so you can finally leave, right? Being patient is waiting for the child to button up their own shoe, which takes forever, right? We think of sitting and waiting. We think of going to the DMV, being patient and waiting on someone else to do something that makes no sense so that you can do something that's worthwhile. It's a very passive phrase, but here in Romans 12:12, Paul's not using a passive phrase. That word patient doesn't mean to sit and wait. It really means to persevere or to endure. It's an action-oriented word. And I think if we were just sitting around talking, we typically don't think of being patient or having patience as being action-oriented. We think of the opposite. But here Paul is telling us in tribulation, in difficulty, that we're to endure, we're to persevere. And I started to think about how did I learn what that meant? Where did that start in my life? To endure or to persevere, to be patient, and let's not go too deep, but just in situations that are uncomfortable. Maybe circumstances that we don't like. And I started thinking back on my life, and I realized that it really started as a child in a car ride. Think about it. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there? Right? That was my experience. Maybe it wasn't yours. That was my sister, not my parents. But that's where I started to learn what it meant to endure, to persevere, as being a child in a car ride. Or maybe as an older child, I would get a punishment, maybe being grounded or being restricted. That's what we called it. We called it restriction. But that sounds way too negative, so it's grounded or it's time out, right? But I started to learn what it meant to wait, to be patient, to endure the punishment as an older child. And as I became a teenager, I started to learn what it meant to train. As I got involved in different sports or I started working in class or started dealing with individuals in relationship, and I had to wait on other people to do something, or in sports as I had to develop something before I could actually put it into practice, I learned what it meant to endure, what it meant to persevere through difficulty. You know, I was really, really bad at wrestling my freshman year. I was 8-11, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that 4 of those 8 wins were forfeit wins, which means the other team didn't have anyone to wrestle me, so I literally walked out there in my singlet and they just raised my hand and I got a win. Nobody else out there but me and the ref. The other 4 wins were against the same guy. So really I was like 1-11, but it looked like 8-11, which was a lot better, and that's what my parents told people. But my second year, my sophomore year, I went to a wrestling camp at NC State. And I learned a lot. My second year, I was a state finalist here in South Carolina. As a matter of fact, I was medically disqualified and ultimately dubbed a co-state champion. But I got the silver medal, which is what all that mattered to me. But I had to learn what it meant to persevere through difficulty. Through training and running and lifting weights and cutting weight and learning different moves. And sometimes, even in wrestling, you have to wait for the guy to do something stupid so that you can actually move in to get the hold that will ultimately make you win the match. Think about it in sports. In soccer, I played soccer. We looked for openings. We passed the ball around. I know a lot of Americans get frustrated watching soccer because they, why are you going backwards? It's America. We go forwards, man. Right? Well, think about it more like basketball. You pass the ball around. You wait for the team to make a mistake. You patiently wait, but it's not just a sitting back. It's an action thing. It's an endurance. It's a perseverance. And when the moment arises, you move. And I learned that as a teenager, what it meant to endure, to persevere. And perhaps you're like I was as a young single man. You had to persevere through singleness. See, I wanted to be married and I wanted to have kids when I was in 3rd grade. And that's not like a preacher joke. I've got literally a blue ribbon for winning a story contest, telling a story about my dad, about me, and about my son. We were all named Stephen Philip, and that actually happened in real life. Mac is the 3rd. And so being single, and in high school I couldn't get a date. I couldn't pay for a date. If you saw pictures of me in high school, you fully understand. And then you get to know my personality, which is smothering. So it just was bad. I had to learn what it meant to endure, to persevere through that singleness when all I really, truly wanted in my heart was to be married, to be in that relationship, to enjoy what I perceived as God's will for my life. And I had to learn what that meant. And then as I was married, we had to learn what perseverance and endurance was in having a child. And perhaps you've been there. Perhaps you've struggled with fertility. Or maybe the pregnancy has not been easy. Maybe there have been some miscarriages. Or maybe you've had the child and then you really know what it means to persevere. There's a difficulty. There's an active, an endurance that's required in these seasons. And I learned that as a parent of young children. And then God made the really big mistake and asked me to be a leader in the church. And listen, I love the church, but y'all require endurance. Perseverance, man. Sometimes we get caught up on the dumbest stuff. Whether it's the color of a carpet, which we don't have to worry about in the gymnasium, or about how loud a drum is, or what song's being played, or what somebody said or what somebody posted on social media or what so-and-so is doing and you didn't get invited. I mean, that takes endurance. But really just walking with each other and learning what it means to be a Christian and how to honor Christ. As a young leader, I've had to learn perseverance and endurance in that. And I think if you look at our two churches, Trinity and GCC, as a young church, we're learning what that means to endure the difficulty of having to build and having to trust and not having a history or even a very large bank account to rest on or anything like that. And I think you look at Trinity and you think we've been through so much and we have so much legacy and why aren't people here and why has God moved the way he has and why hasn't God moved the way we thought and the way we prayed. Being a church, a community of faith, it takes endurance. And it's not just this passive sit back and be patient. Oh, well, God's got it under control. There's an activity to it. But as I think over all these situations, and as I prayed for God to reveal something to me, he really did. That every time I think of endurance, and I would bet if you're anything like me that you feel this way too, that when you think about being patient and enduring situations and learning perseverance, that every single example you can come up with is earthly in nature. It's something of this world. Whether it's a medical diagnosis or a relationship or the lack of or a difficulty or finances. Every situation, every example I could think of how God has taught me endurance and perseverance, it terminated in this world. In this lifetime. And that's when it occurred to me that perhaps, just maybe, the greatest lesson in patience and endurance that we ever get is this lifetime. You see, our struggle with being patient in tribulation isn't a circumstantial issue. It's a perspective issue. Let's say that again. Our struggle with being patient in tribulation isn't a circumstantial issue. It's a perspective issue. And I don't mean the perspective of, well, somebody else somewhere has got it worse than me. That's perspective, yes, but that's not the kind of perspective I'm talking about. This week, as we celebrated the life of my good friend Robbie Ott, the Lord showed me what it meant to be patient in tribulation over the last 5 years. I want you to see this man that I'm talking about. And some of you have seen it on Facebook, you've seen it on my posts or other people's posts. But this is my friend Robbie Ott, who is 40 years old and has been a pastor for as long as I've been a pastor. He was a pastor at a church nearby. He was a youth pastor, and I was the youth pastor, and we went to college together, and so we did a lot together. And perhaps you saw the ridiculously terrible, goofy video that I posted of us when we did some stuff together. If you haven't, go on Facebook. You'll enjoy it. It's a good laugh. I was wearing a 3-piece corduroy suit from the 1970s and flip-flops. But Robbie served in some traditional churches. He served at First Baptist Florence, and then back in spring, he and another pastor, Rex, they just planted a church called the Garden Church. And so I've been able to watch him and walk with him over the last few years. And 5 years ago, when he was diagnosed, nearly 5 years ago, when he was diagnosed with colon cancer, I went to visit him, and I think I have a picture of that. This picture was Robbie and I just after his diagnosis, not too long after his diagnosis 5 years ago. And I got to watch his life over the next few years. And I already knew Robbie, but I don't think I understood exactly what God was doing in his life. Because Robbie loved his family. Robbie had 4 kids, has 4 kids. There's kids. That's Bryson there on your right. He's the oldest. He's a rising junior. Then his youngest child there on the other right, on the other side, he's a 6-year-old. He's a rising first grader. His daughter is a rising freshman, and his other son there is a rising 5th grader. That's his wife, April. And there's a lot that he was passionate about. A lot. He's passionate about Gamecocks for some crazy reason. Y'all get real excited about them. They don't give you a whole lot to be excited about, but good for you. He's excited. He's passionate about. He's passionate about golf and tennis. He would beat me in those constantly, all the time. He had no, oh, you're a good friend, Philip. Let me give you a whole. Nope. He was just destroying me. He was passionate about his family, though. And over these years, there were pictures of he and his family just in his house worshiping. I think we have a picture of that as well. They just pull out the guitar. He was passionate about worship. He was passionate about church. He was passionate about discipleship. He was passionate about his children, his wife. And if you do the math, he's got a rising first grader who's 6 years old. That means that a year after his youngest child was born, he was diagnosed with that cancer. And so for nearly 5 years, Robbie has been fighting. He's been enduring. He's been persevering for the sake of his family, for the sake of his God, for the glory of his Lord. You see, this man that I knew, he taught me so much about what it meant to serve God with a glad heart. And as I sat with him just nearly 3 weeks ago in his house, I drove over to spend the day with him, and we talked about church planting and about church people and how terrible you all are and how wonderful it is to serve you. We talked about family and talked about children. We talked about gear. He was just a gearhead. He had all the new iPad Pro and these earbuds that are amazing. I can't even explain to you what they do. But at the end of the day, he got out of that hospital bed in his living room. He put on his jacket, was helped into the wheelchair and taken to the car so he could go to his son's swim meet. See, there's a lot of ways that you can approach life. There's a lot of ways that you can approach tribulation. But what Paul is telling us here is that it's not a passive thing. And perhaps that thing that you're wrestling with, that circumstance, that difficulty, isn't the challenge you think it is. Perhaps this life is our challenge. You see, if you are a Christian, and I gather you may not be, and we're just glad that you're here. If you're not a believer and you're here with a friend or you're here checking this thing out, we're so glad that you're here. But if you are a Christian, if you're a believer, a follower of Jesus, then Scripture tells us that this life that we're living, this short breath that we have on the world, this is truly our greatest tribulation. This is not our home. And though you may be like me and it seems that nothing is working out the way you thought it should, that whatever car you drive is going to break down, whatever trip you plan is going to have a curveball thrown at it, no matter how much you save, it's always going to be another thing that requires money. No matter how many relationships you pursue or how long you wait or how much you pray, it just doesn't seem to work out. See, these are all just little circumstances in the great tribulation that is our lives. And Paul is telling us we're to be patient, we're to endure, we're to persevere in this tribulation, not for our own glory, but for the glory of our Father. So that those who see us in this, like I did for the last 5 years, watching my friend live life, not simply die, not waste away, but to live. That people will see us, regardless of our circumstances, and think, what is it about you? And we will simply say, it's God. I was not made for this world. I will endure. I will persevere. But in the same way that Matthew shared last week, that to rejoice in hope, we have to set our eyes on things above. In order to have this kind of perseverance, this endurance, this patience in tribulation, our perspective has to shift to things of above. And a change in perspective doesn't make the tribulation any easier. It simply gives us the motivation needed to endure. As we ask God to help us see things through His perspective, as we ask God and start to believe that we can see our lives as this tribulation that draws us nearer and dearer to Him, that will give us the motivation to endure whatever circumstance we find ourselves in. Charles Spurgeon said it this way: in heaven, we shall see that we had not one trial too many. Give me a break, Lord. Come on, I just need a season of rest. In heaven, we will recognize that we did not need it. It was not too much to bear. I do wish my friend was still here. I do wish that daughter has a father to walk her down the aisle one day. I do wish that those sons had a dad cheering in the audience upon graduation. I do wish those things for him. I wish that April was able to grow old with Robbie. I wish those things for him. But I saw in my friend Robbie what Paul talks about in Romans 12:12. Though his body was beginning to deteriorate and his arm was that big around, though every vital sign medically was saying that he was not doing well, his spiritual health was going so much better than any of us could have hoped. His perspective on life, his perspective on family, his perspective on church was growing closer and closer to perfection. What is your vital sign saying when you're facing these difficulties? When you're walking through tribulation? Are you just losing it like we do so many times? Are you trying to track down a guy who yelled at your wife in traffic? Are you losing sleep because of a diagnosis? Are you bringing bitterness and shame and depression to the world around you because you haven't found satisfaction in a relationship like you want? Or are you allowing God to perfect you through tribulation? Are you persevering? Are you enduring? Now, I'll tell you, you can't change your perspective alone. You'll need the Holy Spirit's help because that's His job. And if you come back next week, you'll hear a little bit more about how to do that well. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we thank you so much for the peace and the joy that you bring in our lives. But God, help us to thank you as well for the difficulty. Help us to recognize that this is not our home. And Lord, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in here today that are walking through very, very challenging circumstances. And even if we don't consider them challenging, that any individual that's walking through something and they're coming to you for it, they feel it's challenging, it's difficult. So God, I pray that you'd hear those prayers, but Lord, please help us all to see it from your perspective, to understand what it means to endure, to be patient, to persevere through this tribulation. Thank you for the great examples that we have had in our friends, our family, and you, Jesus. God, we give you our lives. We offer ourselves for your glory. Help us to be the kind of church that stands strong together through difficulty. not so that we can be okay, but so that you can receive your glory. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.